The Village at the Edge of the World by Stuart Fridd. Alexander had left home, the hotel that he'd been living in for the last 3 months, knowing that this mission with the professor might well be his last. Now, lurching from side to side, the carriage's large wooden wheels seemed to find every dip and hole in the rutted track. Their journey from the town of Carderby had been pleasant for the most part. Smooth roads and blue skies. Villagers on their journey had been warm and welcoming to them, perhaps thinking that they were father and son, happy to offer the two travellers lodging and food, at least until Alexander accidentally mentioned their destination, the village of Bleakhope. Smiles that had initially greeted them suddenly turned to tight-lipped grimaces when Alexander let slip where their business led them. The warm, sparkling eyes of tavern owners shrank to suspicious slits, and friendly nods and raised glasses to toast their health were replaced with stony silences, cold looks, and women who hastily ushered their children away. But since their task had pulled them north, the hospitality was not the only thing to have turned cold. Just the day before, Alexander had worried that his pale, freckled skin would burn under a bright summer sun, untouched by even the smallest cloud. Now, it was as if this part of England had decided to skip the end of summer and the whole of autumn altogether and go straight to an early winter. A blanket of unseasonal grey covered the sky and patches of mist drifted across the moors. To compound the situation, the smooth main routes had turned into potted dirt tracks, and it had slowed their progress to a crawl as their two horses struggled to find safe footing. "Ow!" Alexander said, rubbing his elbow as the cart jolted again, banging him against one of the professor's large wooden crates. "Not much further now, an hour or so, I'd guess," the professor said, not taking his eye from the track. Alexander knew it wasn't a guess. Professor Cordite never guessed. He meticulously calculated possibilities and made well-informed hypotheses, but he never guessed. As they swayed and bumped onwards, Alexander wiped the water away from his freckled face and off his mousy brown hair that flopped above his eyes. It had begun to rain. Not real rain. Real rain fell from the sky as drops. This was English rain. Drizzle. The almost imperceptible kind of rain that hung and blew in the air, soaking you through to your bones. Alexander had packed and dressed for summer and was feeling woefully unprepared. Professor Cordite pulled the leather collar of his full-length black coat high around his neck and dipped his brown tricorn hat in front of his eyes, trying to keep the water from his grizzled face. He looked more like a highwayman than a university professor to Alexander. "I told you to dress for winter," he said, as if he could read Alexander's mind. "Did you at least remember to pack the crystals?" "Yes," Alexander answered confidently, trying to remember if he had in fact packed them. "And have you your violin?" "Yes," Alexander answered, unsure why he would need his violin on such a mission. "Good," he said, nodding to himself. They rode on for a while longer, the farms and villages left far behind, the land becoming ragged and rocky, with wild heather adding some muted colour to the bleak grey countryside. "Damn! I didn't pack the iron bolts." "I packed them, and the silver crossbow bolts, just in case," he added proudly. The professor turned and gave Alexander a tiny nod and an almost imperceptible smile. "Good lad. Your father would have been proud." This compliment warmed Alexander more than any winter coat could have, at least for a while. The roads and weather continued to worsen the further north they travelled. The patches of mist had banded together and were now merging into a thick fog. Gooseflesh appeared on Alexander's arms, and he hugged himself tighter, although he wasn't entirely sure it was because of the cold. An uneasy feeling had begun to grow deep within his stomach. The feeling had slithered up his spine and he shivered, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up like the hackles on a startled cat. The horizon had long since disappeared behind a thick veil of grey, and with each minute his world seemed to shrink. For a while, before the mist consumed them completely, he could see part way across the moors. Strange standing stones stood like huge solemn sentries, watching over the leafless skeletal trees that had managed to find enough good earth to take root in. The foul-smelling fog grew thicker, and still even the edges of the road were not clear in some parts. "This is too dangerous, we should stop," the professor said. "If the road turned sharply, we could go crashing down into a ditch." But Professor Cordite didn't stop. Alexander guessed that, like himself, the professor carried that growing fear inside him too, and didn't want to hang around longer than he had to. The horses were walking so slowly they had almost come to a stop. Every step into the wall of mist took an agonizingly long time as the horses paused to survey their footing. The professor looked around him, eyes darting to every shadow that moved in the mist. The horses grew increasingly skittish, snuffling and whinnying, taking bad steps and jerking the cart around. With growing dread, Alexander wondered what could be scaring the horses that had been so placid until now, and realized he had not seen another animal for some miles. Rabbits, deer, pheasants and sparrows, so abundant back near the last village, were now nowhere to be seen. In fact, apart from the panting of the horses, the clopping of hooves and the wheels of their cart, the world was silent. As if in mockery of these thoughts, a loud cawing burst out from the back of the cart. Alexander jumped and span round. A black crow the size of a house cat was sitting on the back of the cart, staring at the professor and Alexander, tilting its head to one side then the other. The professor looked panicked at the sight of it, but he tore his eyes away, knowing that to lose concentration now, as he tried to guide the horses the last few miles down the lane, could be fatal. "Shoot! Get out of here!" Alexander said, waving the bird away with his hands. The crow didn't flinch and cawed again, raising its head to the sky. "Ah! Ah! Ah!" it taunted. His heart now racing, Alexander tried to flick at the bird, desperate for the creature to fly off and leave them alone. It pecked out at Alexander's hand in protest, its glassy eyes cold and calculating, and then flew off, disappearing into the grey, its raspberry cawing echoing off the mist, making it sound as if crows were all around them. "Whatever happens, don't run off. Stay with me in the cart," Professor Cordite said, not making Alexander feel any better about their situation. Why would he run off? The professor stared behind them for a moment, then span back around, whipping the reins. "Yah! Yah!" he shouted, the horses springing into a blind canter. Alexander turned and looked behind the cart to see what had terrified the professor so much. Tall silhouettes of men loomed in the mist behind the cart. The horses broke into a gallop, lurching the cart into the air. Grabbing the side of the carriage, Alexander held on as they bucked and twisted this way and that, nearly throwing him from his seat. Finding the carriage, Alexander looked behind him again and saw the silhouettes were still there. Somehow, they were effortlessly keeping pace with the cart, even though they didn't seem to be running or moving at all. It was as if they were gliding upright towards them, totally unaffected by the uneven road. "There's the inn up ahead! Hold on!" the professor cried. Although the building was still hidden by the fog, Alexander could see orange lights coming from windows some distance down the road. Gripping on as tightly as he could, he pushed his feet into the corners of the footwell, trying desperately to wedge himself in. A silhouette appeared in front of them, and it seemed suddenly to Alexander that these were not shadows of men at all. The shadows' arms were too long, their heads too thin. The shadow that blocked their way in the thick mist ahead terrified the horses as much as they did Alexander. It sent the two mares careering off the road, their eyes bulging and desperate. They neighed and bucked, trying to shake off the cart, foam flying from their mouths. Alexander was shaken like a rag doll, smashing wildly from side to side as the cart snapped and cracked. There was an almighty splash as the horses led the doomed cart hurtling into a pond. Alexander's grip was broken as the cart was thrown onto its side, and he plunged head first into the water, one of the wooden crates striking his head as he fell. Blackness engulfed him, and he sank without a struggle to the bottom of the pond.